What is that supposed to look like? What are speech and language disorders and how do they affect student development and their learning? What are some red flags to look for, and what are the resources that are available to you? I would love to know, just so we can focus our presentation and make it the most useful, who is in our audience tonight? Are you teachers? Are you parents? Are you concerned about young kids? Are you thinking about older kids? If there's no specification and you're just here to learn, that's totally fine too. But we want to make sure that it's useful for all that are here. So we're going to start with what is our scope. Oh, good. You guys are chatting in. Parent and preschool teacher, a parent of an 11-year-old. Awesome. Tutor with grade school students. So it looks like we've got a variety of age groups and a variety of participants. So that's awesome. Okay, so this is our scope of practice for all speech language pathologists. The areas on the left are the areas that we really focus on at Groves and the ones that we're going to be talking about the most tonight. Speech production, articulation, that's what we're most well known for probably, is working with students on pronouncing sounds. We also work with students that have difficulty with fluency. We work with students who have difficulty with receptive and expressive language. That's the biggest area that we're going to talk about tonight. It has the most different types of issues that could be going on. And then we also do a lot with cognition, problem solving, and executive functioning. We work with students and adults who have difficulty with memory. We know we can't change someone's memory, but we can give them compensatory strategies. So that's part of that cognitive piece. All of the areas on the right are areas that speech language pathologists are certified in, and we are certified in, but they are not a focus of our treatment at Groves. So we will briefly talk through these areas so that if there are people here that have students with these concerns, you know that a speech language therapist can help and kind of how, but we're really going to be focusing more on these areas on the left side tonight. This is another great visual. Some of our slides tonight, you will be getting a PDF of the slides, and some of them we've really put in here as more of a resource for you guys to be able to look back on and use more than something that we're going to talk through fully. So this is one of those slides. It's a great visual. It covers all the different areas that a speech language pathologist might cover. We're not going to read the whole thing, but this is a different way of showing you our scope of practice, and you can use it as a resource later on.
All right, so starting off looking at and talking about articulation, like Megan said, this is one of the largest and most well-known parts of our field and profession. Articulation refers to a student's ability to produce and make all the different sounds in their language. So here on this slide, it shows kind of a breakdown of when typically these sounds are developed in majority of children that speak English. And this looks at specifically in students in the United States. So this is really specific to the people here in our country speaking English. Looking at kind of the breakdown, some of the earlier sounds that are developed are things like P's, B's, and M's. And one reason why those sounds are on the earlier side of development is because a young kid can see that being produced on somebody else's mouth. So if a parent is kind of babbling or playing with sounds with them and they're going ba, 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 the kid can see those sounds being made. So that kind of gives them another support in learning those sounds earlier. As you go up to the later developing sounds, they get more complex. So things like R's and TH's, those require a really specific placement of the tongue. Everything in the mouth has to be really well coordinated, so it becomes more difficult for some students. Some of those later developing sounds and ones that we often work on with students on are things like CH's, R's, S, SH's, and L's. Those are really common for speech language pathologists to support those sounds. Looking at kind of this graphic again, it's important to note that in a typically developing student, all of these sounds are acquired and developed by age 6. So if any student over the age of 6 is having difficulty producing any sounds, that would be considered atypical and grounds for consulting a speech language pathologist. There is some kind of wiggle room, you know, in those 6 and 7-year-old ranges, but in a typically developing student, all of the sounds are being produced by age 6. Some of the sounds might, and the errors might persist later on for a couple of reasons. One reason a student might have persistent speech difficulties is if they have a structural abnormality. So that's something like a cleft palate. If there is air going between their mouth and their nasal cavity, that's going to change the way their sounds are produced because of that structural piece. There's also some motor planning difficulties that might impact somebody's ability to produce sounds. So that's when the message that they have in their brain kind of gets confused or lost on the way to their mouth. So they might know the sound they want to make, they can make it, but it doesn't always come out the way that they were planning on it. And that sometimes is called childhood apraxia of speech. So that's a motor difficulty that impacts speech production. And then finally, if a student has a sensory deficit, so something like a hearing loss, that's going to impact their speech articulation as well. If they're not able to compare the way they say something to the way their peers say something, they can't hear that difference. They might have a hard time correcting their sounds or knowing what that correct production is like. So students with hearing loss may have persistent articulation. All right, so this slide looks at some information and data around speech intelligibility, and that refers to how well somebody can understand the student's speech. So early on, when a student is 2 years old or even younger, it's really common for a parent or a close caregiver to know what they're saying when a stranger would have no idea. So those close people to them can understand a young child more than a stranger, and that's totally normal. As kids get older and approach 5 years of age, almost all students, so 90 to 100% of students, are completely understandable to a stranger. So that is a good kind of benchmark. If your students in those 5 to 7 year ranges, and they're still hard to understand for new listeners, that might be kind of a something to take note of in terms of exploring a speech and language evaluation. So once they get to that 5 to 7 year range, any errors or anyone who has a difficult time understanding them, that might be a flag to go and get some more information on articulation and speech production. All right, and this slide is another one of those good resource slides for you to have. So keep this for your records to go back on in terms of signs of a disorder and some information about what you can do. One thing that I want to point out on this slide is that if you have a student or a child that has some speech production errors, continuing to model or kind of rephrasing it with accurate production will be something that is beneficial. We don't recommend that you kind of point out the mistake they made, but rather kind of rephrase it. So if a student makes an error, follow up by saying it correctly without giving them direct feedback of you said this wrong. So continuing to be a positive role model. Really at the end of the day, we want to continue to foster communication, and we want the child to have a positive experience around expressing their ideas. So keeping it positive will kind of be a good thing for their overall speech and language development. All right, and this is a fun picture. It's kind of a funny example, but it's also really important because it demonstrates that articulation and speech sound errors can potentially lead to academic difficulties. And there is this tie between speech production and academics. So it is something to be taken seriously as well. In this picture, you see a drawing at the top and a word at the bottom. I want you all to just take a second and think about what that word might mean, or what that word is that the child is attempting to spell. If anyone feels confident or has a funny guess that they want to put in the chat, feel free. All right, walks, Lorax, any other guesses? All right, George nailed it. It's Lorax. So here's a picture of a tree and an orange person, and this is supposed to say Lorax. So this student likely has difficulty with both their L and their R sounds. Think about how many times students here just sound it out. Well, if their sounds don't match their letters, then sounding it out might lead to something like this. This kid did sound it out, and for them it sounded like WOAC. So this is an example of that academic impact that speech and articulation might have as a student progresses through their academic career. All right, this is the end of the articulation section. So this would be a good time for any questions we've had up to this point.
No questions. There was a comment that came in about someone's child, and it says, my daughter's preschool teacher said she could understand her, so she wasn't concerned. It turned out my daughter was 1.5 years delayed with speech. Her kindergarten teacher said the same thing, that she wasn't worried because she could understand her, but there's a big delay, we found out. So she's saying, you know, she's offering this the benchmark because it can be misunderstood as there's not being a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to note there is that a teacher and a preschool teacher, both the kindergarten and preschool, are going to be close caregivers. So if they're working with a student every single day, they're going to be get familiar and be familiar with their communication style. So we want to consider both the age of the student and whether they're still producing errors at that age and if it's appropriate, and then also how intelligible they are to a stranger. All right. So the next piece we're going to talk about language. This is a really big, broad term, and there's a lot of information under this category. So I'm going to try to break it down for you the best that I can. Language is the ability to both produce and understand. So producing meaning speaking and writing, understanding meaning listening and reading. So when we're talking about language, it can be both spoken language and written language. When we talk about language disorders, it's usually referring to spoken language, whereas a reading or writing disorder would be usually called a specific learning disorder in those areas. A lot of people don't realize that the prevalence of a language disorder is quite high. 5 to 10% of children have a developmental language disorder. This is a diagnosis you can grow out of through intervention, or sometimes people mature out of it, but it is quite common in childhood for kids to have difficulty with spoken language. In fact, it's the most common developmental disability of childhood. There are kind of 3 different categories of language disorder. You can have a receptive language disorder where you're having trouble understanding, but you can express yourself just fine. That's pretty rare because if you think about it, it's going to be hard to express yourself at a higher level than what you understand. There's expressive language disorder, which we see really commonly with students with ADHD. And that's where students understand everything really well, but they have a hard time expressing themselves at that same level. And then a mixed receptive and expressive would be when the kids are having trouble with both understanding and producing language. A language disorder can exist on its own as its own thing or in conjunction with other conditions. And a lot of times a language disorder diagnosis goes hand in hand with hearing loss, autism, ADHD, a traumatic brain injury, an intellectual disability. Each of those populations is unique, of course, but they all have oftentimes difficulty with spoken language. This is another resource slide for all of you, signs of a language disorder, and this is, of course, trying to catch it early. So these signs only go up to 2.5 or 3 years old. And then again, some tips for parents and caregivers for what you can do in order to help. And obviously, we also recommend, if you have these concerns, to seek a professional in addition to using some strategies at home. These slides are also meant for a resource, these ones coming up. They are meant to give you an idea of the skills that kids in these grades typically should have. So a kindergartner should be able to follow 1 to 2 step directions and answer basic yes/no questions, talk about their experiences or be able to retell a story they've heard. So we're not going to go through each of these slides, but they're kind of some good benchmarks for each grade level, starting at grade school age, for what kids should be able to do with their language kind of broadly at these ages. So if you're looking at your student's grade and you're finding that there's a lot of things on one or both of the areas that they have a hard time with, that's going to be a signal to you that an evaluation might not be a bad idea.
All right, and this slide is here to kind of illustrate that an individual with a language difficulty, that's going to impact them across all areas of their life and across all areas of school. So difficulty with language is not isolated to just reading and writing class. That's part of it. But it also may be hard for them to follow spoken directions, like in gym class, or understanding word problems in math. Like there's language in other courses too. Communicating or the social aspect with peers during recess might be impacted. These students might have difficulty writing a paper for a class like social studies, or reading and comprehending instructions in something like art. So language difficulties might affect the individual across all aspects of the school day. Language difficulties can also be misconstrued as a behavior deficit or a behavior difficulty. If an individual is having a hard time matching words with their emotions or verbalizing and expressing what happened to them, that could get really frustrating. And we often see that these students feel like their only way of communicating or expressing their feelings and what happened is through a behavior outburst. So really getting to the bottom of the language piece often can be really freeing and provide that behavior support in addition to the language support. So this, any sort of language difficulty can become really complex, and kind of getting to the bottom of what they're having a hard time with is going to be super beneficial across many aspects of their life, including the behavior side. Again, we have some more resource and reference slides for you coming up here. So when you're looking at these slides, this is demonstrating some academic skills that might be difficult if a student has a language disorder or language difficulty. So at each grade and age level, it's displaying some things that might be difficult for students with language difficulties.
Sorry, it took me a second to find my unmute button. Before I get into attention deficits and how those impact language and kind of how ADHD and language are related, are there any questions about language disorder? or language development?
I haven't had anything come in yet.
Okay, awesome. So attention deficits hugely impact language abilities, and we oftentimes see students with ADHD and executive functioning difficulties also have difficulty with language skills. There are some examples here for you on some of the things that might be difficult because of attention deficits. So kids with ADHD are more likely than other kids to start talking late, and they have difficulty planning and organizing their thoughts and paying attention to details. So that's going to make it difficult for them to tell a story, write a story, or even if they're reading or listening to a story, making sure that they are catching all the important pieces. A lot of times students with ADHD have difficulty with word retrieval. So this is kind of that tip of the tongue phenomenon where they know what they want to say. They might even have a picture of it in their brain, but they just can't find that word for it. That has a lot to do with organization. So if a student doesn't have logical organization of how they kind of categorize vocabulary and connect ideas, they have a harder time retrieving the words they want to use. Students with ADHD oftentimes have trouble with response inhibition or impulse control. So that can sometimes be difficult in a social setting when we're talking about language, because they might be tempted to say everything that comes to their mind, talk out of turn, interrupt others. They also have trouble with working memory. So sometimes it's that they want to get out what they want to say before it leaves their head. They might have trouble filtering distractions. So that's going to affect listening and reading comprehension if they're having trouble focusing on the teacher because there's a bird chirping in their ear out the window, or their friend is trying to tell them something. That's going to affect language, of course. They also might have difficulty using and understanding sentence structure. As sentences get longer and more complex, that affects their ability to speak, their ability to write, their ability to comprehend. And then they also may have difficulty with vocabulary, using context clues and making inferences. Specifically with that making inferences and using context clues piece, that requires taking in a lot of different details and subtle cues, which of course takes attention to be able to do that. And the other piece that we find is that students with ADHD and executive functioning difficulty oftentimes have trouble with working memory or processing speed. And those two cognitive skills are really, really highly related to language. Being able to keep information in your mind while you manipulate it, being able to create kind of a mental picture while you're reading requires working memory and processing speed, taking notes, following along in a conversation. So those are just some examples of how attention and executive functioning are related to language. I saw a couple chats come in there. Do we have some questions?
Nope, just a few comments that says this is really helpful and thank you.
Of course, yes. I'm glad it's helpful. This is an example of what word retrieval difficulty might look like. This is an actual student that I did an evaluation with. He does have ADHD and he is extremely bright and understands everything that is said to him, but has a really hard time expressing himself at that same level. So we were doing a narrative sample to try to figure out where the breakdown in his storytelling ability. So I had read him a story about a student that made a gift for a friend for their birthday. And then I gave him a prompt to say, can you tell me a story about a time when you made something? And he had an example of what a similar story would be, because I had just read one to him. And his response was, I made a present for my mom for Mother's Day. And I waited a second and then I said, okay, is there anything else you can tell me about it? He said, nope. And I said, oh, okay, well, what did you make? And then you can see here that his response is quite long and has a lot of words, but by the end of it, we still don't really know what he made. There's not a lot of substance here. So it says, it was a thing where it had like, well, it wasn't, well, I kind of forgot, but I knew that I made it. And it was something about like, well, I don't really remember that much about it. I just know that I made it because Well, I know that I made it because I wrote it on a piece of paper that I made something for my mom for Mother's Day. So that's an example of him really having difficulty organizing his thoughts, putting them in order, giving the listener enough context and enough detail for them to understand what it is that he's talking about. So that's just kind of a good illustration of what that might look and feel like.
And that is a great segue to talk a little bit more about what narrative discourse is and why it's so important when looking at somebody's language abilities. So the narrative discourse is referring to somebody's ability to tell a story. And it is kind of unique because it falls in between conversation and like reading a story in terms of how much structure you're provided. So in conversation, it's really unstructured, can be a little bit more casual. Whereas if you're reading a story, it's very structured. You have it all laid out in front of you. The narrative piece is in the middle where you want to come up with that structure, that kind of framework for telling a story, but you have some freedom in the ideas that you come up with and how you make it your own. And it's really a significant predictor of success in school and overall language skills. So it's something that we look at really often when we're doing a language assessment to understand what somebody's functional language is like when they're in conversation and communicating with their peers and family. Telling a narrative, like Megan said, is really complex. It requires the ability to kind of plan and organize. So what is the story I want to tell? What details are most important? But what details do I need to leave out? What should come first, then next, and then having that sequence. And then a really complex and kind of subtle aspect of narratives is that character, emotion, and motive piece that really gives a lot more depth to a narrative or a story. Sorry, I got a little delay on the slide switching on my side. Megan, can you click it by chance? Yay, thank you. All right, so this quote here is kind of explaining and emphasizing the importance of understanding the narrative framework in order to have successful storytelling or narrative skills. So I'm going to read it out loud and then explain it to you guys a little bit more. It says, as children encounter multiple narratives over time, they begin to understand that most narratives contain specific elements: goal-oriented characters, problem, resolution. This implicit knowledge of story structure assists the reader in predicting what is likely to happen next in a newly encountered narrative, constraining the possibilities for developing the situation model. And the situation model is saying that when a student is exposed to multiple narratives or they are reading lots of stories, it becomes easier for them to predict what's going to happen next. And that structure of settings and problems and characters becomes more natural. They don't have to think about it as much. And that takes off the demand in the moment if it becomes more implicit. So continued exposure to narrative structure and practice developing cohesive narratives is going to be super beneficial for children in these early elementary years to assist with their comprehension, to help out with that inferencing and predicting piece, as well as improving their own narrative production abilities. I see a question pop up, so I'm just going to answer it right now. It says, are you referring mainly to just reading them a lot of stories? This quote specifically is referring to reading and being exposed to story structure through like reading stories. However, narratives are occurring throughout all of our days, even if it's not in a specific reading a story. So if you think about, if you ask somebody what they did today and they tell you, well, I was at work and then I forgot my lunch, so I had to run to the store really quick and it was really busy. You know, that's an example of a narrative. So narratives can be more structured in that reading a story or just having those conversations and throwing them in to your interactions with your students as well.
A great way to foster this too, if you notice that you're working with a student that's having trouble with narratives, is if they start a story like, well, at school today I forgot my lunch, and that's just where they stop. Continue probing them for things like, well, that sounds like a big problem. What did you do to solve that problem? How did it make you feel? Oh, I'm so glad you found a solution to that problem, right? So you're kind of encouraging them to continuing to add and add those different parts of what you usually find in a narrative.
All right, so students who have language disorders might have difficulty with both the literal aspect of comprehension, so recalling specific facts from stories, as well as the inferencing piece. So there's kind of two sides to the comprehension of narratives. And this could be partially due to that lack of the understanding of narrative structure, as well as less exposure or practice with listening and telling stories. So continuing to read stories, having those conversations about having, oh, what was the problem? Who was all there? What did you do next? Are all great ways to foster the narrative discourse for these students. And students who have language disorders tend to tell stories that are shorter and less complex. So they might have fewer details, less complex sentence structure, or they might have difficulty with the organization piece and planning of their narrative. So here I have two examples of different narratives to kind of compare what a student with a language disorder and a student with typical language development might produce to kind of visualize what this looks like. So here we have a first grade student who does have a language disorder. And here her story says, Greg sitted by his friend. He was quiet. His friend was hilarious, loud. Greg didn't get to go outside because of his friend. He said to the teacher, could I move away from my friend? So here you can notice a couple things about the student's narrative. It's definitely shorter and also has some errors in the sentence structure, like when it says his friend was hilarious loud. So that's something I noticed right away. It also is a little bit hard to follow when you're listening to all the facts. At the end of it, you're not totally sure what happened. You kind of have to fill in the blanks and kind of make some guesses maybe about what the story is telling you. And it lacks kind of a conclusion, so it doesn't have a strong ending. So this is an example of a first grader with a language disorder. And then in comparison, this is a narrative production by a first grader with typical language abilities. And this narrative says, once Hugo was playing outside with his new loud puppy, and he went to one of his practices, but he was rushing, so he forgot to close the gate. And then when he came back, he was looking for his puppy. And then he went to his dad and said, help, I accidentally left the gate open and the puppy I love escaped. His dad said, then post up pictures of him, then we can find him. And soon he found the puppy and he was excited. So in this example, you can see that it is longer and includes a lot more detail than the first narrative we saw. It has things like dialogue, which is demonstrating a more complex narrative skill. And at the end, you really have a good picture of what the story is that the student is telling. So looking at these two narratives side by side really illustrates what the difference in narrative skills can look like. So that it's something to pay attention to and kind of notice when your student is telling stories, even just about their day.
All right. Any questions about narratives and that piece before we go on?
No questions have come in yet.
Okay, cool. So this next piece, we're going to talk a lot about executive functioning, and it's not always obvious how executive functioning and language are connected, but I really want to emphasize this piece and this story because this is going to be a really good example of a student whose just by looking at their test scores, you wouldn't assume that they're having language difficulties, excuse me. But then in their day-to-day functioning, they are talking about difficulties they're having, their teachers are experiencing those difficulties. So this is a good example of, even if a student scores high on like the language part of a cognitive test, for example, that doesn't mean that they're in the clear and that they don't have anything with language going on. So we don't want that to be a rule out for not digging deeper if we're seeing some issues. So executive functioning skills, this is a fancier definition, but the executive functioning skills happen in your frontal lobe, and they are the skills that are required to accomplish a goal. So being able to pay attention, manage your time, plan, organize, problem solve, be flexible if something doesn't work out, evaluate your behavior. Those are all executive functioning skills. These are skills that kids with ADHD often have difficulty with, but they're also skills that all kids and teenagers have difficulty with. Executive functioning doesn't typically fully develop until you're almost 30 years old. So we expect all kids and adolescents to have some difficulties in these areas, but obviously it's a continuum and some have more difficulty than others. This is a really long quote, and I thought about taking it out, but the reason that I like it is because it gives a great illustration of all the different executive functioning skills that go into language all day, every day. So kids need to make plans, discuss, evaluate ideas, participate in groups with their peers. They need to reflect on their work. They need to be able to revise and rewrite. And then as they get older, they're expected to do these things more and more independently, and it gets harder and harder. Executive functioning skills are also super critical for social skills, where you have to maintain your attention, update information as people are talking. You have to ignore other stimuli that might be coming in. You also have to formulate your own thoughts and be able to respond. So there's a lot going on in your brain during what seems to be just a really typical, easy thing that you do all day, every day. And I really like this statistic too, because it shows how highly correlated language impairment and executive functioning skills are. So 57% of adolescents that have a language disorder or a specific language impairment have clinically impaired executive functioning skills, whereas 10% of adolescents that don't have a language disorder have that same level of clinically impaired executive functioning skills. So what that's showing us is that there's a really high correlation between language skills and executive functioning. I'm going to talk through a case study here. This is a student who was evaluated at age 5, age 7, and age 11 by a speech language therapist. And therapy was never recommended. His scores were always pretty high, or at least borderline. They always just kept telling him, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. And then he was referred again at the age of 16 because he was still having trouble with oral and written language. And these were his scores after a psychoeducational evaluation. You can see that his verbal scores were astronomically high. So if we just went off of his verbal scores and saw that he was in the 99th percentile and said, clearly his language scores are great, we're not going to do an eval, he wouldn't have gotten the help that he needed, which we'll show in a second. Then you see that his processing speed and his organization, so this is the old Wechsler intelligence scale. So this is the WISC-4, not the WISC-5. So they organize it a little bit differently for those of you that are familiar with cognitive testing. I'm assuming some of you parents out there have kids that have had it done. But what this is showing is that his verbal skills, working memory are really high, but his processing speed is slow. It takes him a long time to take things in, and it takes him a long time to produce language, and it's really hard for him to organize his ideas. So some of the difficulties he was having with speech language were word retrieval. He couldn't formulate his thoughts. He had a really hard time conveying what he meant. He couldn't plan and organize what he was trying to write. And he had a lot of trouble during open-ended discussion, argument, and debate in his classes. And some of the other comments were that he spoke in really short, rapid bursts of speech. He rarely finished a sentence without rephrasing it or just giving up on it. He was really difficult to follow in conversation. He even admitted himself, I have difficulty holding my own in an argument. And then he also said, with writing and talking, too much information floods my mind at once. I don't know how to present it in a clear way. My teachers tell me that I don't provide enough details. So again, looking back at his verbal scores, you wouldn't expect this type of difficulty, but because he has trouble with executive functioning and with processing speed, he's having a really hard time expressing to others what he knows. And this is a really smart kid. His executive functioning skills he was having difficulty with included impulse control, attention, flexibility. He was aware of his difficulties and he tried to use strategies, but couldn't really figure out how to do that on his own. And then he started to doubt himself more and more because he was having all these difficulties and he didn't know why. He commented sometimes, I try to do outlines sometimes, but it just doesn't work. Talking doesn't help because people don't help me focus. Some of his teachers commented that although he continued to speak up, each experience of failure seemed to reinforce his self-doubt. And he said, other people usually articulate my point better than I do. And he has this feeling of like, why can't I figure this out? Why can't I express myself? So George participated in speech language therapy finally at the age of 16. And they worked with him a lot on both the executive functioning piece, self-regulation, organizing his ideas, planning ahead, and also the speech language piece, sentence structure, grammar, how do you present an argument? And I'm going to skip over this because it's a lot of reading to you and I'm seeing a lot of questions coming up, but he had a pre-treatment and post-treatment question, and his responses are starkly different in his organization, how the listener can understand what he's talking about and follow along. So that's George. I saw some questions and comments coming in, so let's take a second to take some time for those.
Yeah, so a few were just comments, and then there were some that were, I'll read you the longer ones here. It says, at some point, can you give any specific tools we can use to build narrative discourse, narrating our day, reading stories, anything else specific, or is this best done by a speech language therapist? And then kind of part two of this question, it says also a bit random, but do you see kids with language disorders easily remediated? Can they catch up to grade level, or do you see them being held back grades, or both?
Great question. So for the first one, for narrative discourse, the best thing that you can do is read. You can also watch like short films and movies and talk and kind of summarize them, talk about them. Or if you just watched a movie with your student, or if they watched it without you, well, what was the movie about? Who were the characters? Where did it take place? What was their problem? And you can also provide examples too, where you're telling a student about something that happened throughout your day. You'll never guess what happened to me today. I was in this place with these people, and all of a sudden, so that they're just hearing that type of discourse all day, every day. And you can also do kind of question and answer activities about like, well, who were the characters? What was the problem? What did they do to solve it? Did that work? How do you think that made them feel? So kind of what you think of as the typical comprehension questions that you might ask. But read is really the best way, because that's how they start to internalize that structure, because there really is kind of a formula, if you think about it, to stories, especially at younger ages. Do you have anything to add there, Catherine?
No, that was pretty thorough.
Okay. And then as far as do students with language disorders typically catch up? So that's a great question. I would say the population that we typically work with at Groves, yes. So the population we typically work with are students that have average to above average intelligence, but might have learning disorders in reading or writing, that have made oral language difficult too because they're so highly related. Or they might have ADHD and executive functioning deficits, but their intelligence is average or above average. Those kids do great with intervention because they understand the tools and strategies that you're using. They're able to learn how to apply them independently pretty quickly. Students that have a harder time catching up and getting up to grade level are students that would have a coexisting like cognitive disability or intellectual disability. It's just in general going to take those kids longer to pick up and be more independent on these skills. And then in terms of holding kids back grades, that happens sometimes. It's not something we typically recommend. There's not very much evidence out there for the benefits of holding kids back a grade. And there's quite a bit of evidence out there for the detriments of holding kids back a grade. So typically we recommend continuing to move along in the grades, but then supplementing with interventions either in school or outside of school or both. But holding them back a grade doesn't typically help them catch up, because what that does is if you're just holding them back a grade without adding any other additional supports, is they're learning the same information the same way they did before. And if we're not changing anything about what we're doing, they're not going to be able to pick up on it any easier the second time than they were the first time. And it also makes it oftentimes is a big hit to self-esteem, or they're not with their same peer group anymore, so their social life changes. So that's my 2 cents on that piece. Anything to add there, Catherine? Okay, cool. Any other questions before we keep going?
Nope, that's it for now.
Okay, awesome.
All right, so like we've kind of hinted at thus far, oral language and literacy or written language are highly interconnected. So if a student has oral language deficits with either understanding or expressing themselves, it is more likely that they will also have impacts on their literacy or their written language skills. So this chart just kind of visualizes how these skills are related. So listening is how you understand language through oral language, whereas reading is how you understand it in writing. On the expressive side, speaking is how we express our ideas in oral language, and writing is how we express our ideas in written language. So the skills are very highly interconnected. Literacy gets more complex, so it's taking kind of those oral language building blocks and foundational skills and kind of taking it to the next step or next level. So we really want to get students to have as strong of oral language as possible before they enter into those literacy stages of early elementary school. Thinking about development, it often starts at the sound level, like we started with articulation. They learn individual sounds, they put them into spoken words, and then before you know it, they're into the writing, either sentence or whole paragraph level. So little by little, all of these skills are adding on to each other.
This is a really awesome visual called the reading rope. It's pretty popular, so some of you may have seen it before, but it's a really good illustration of all the different pieces that go into being a fluent, skilled reader that understands what they're reading. So the top pieces under language comprehension are all the pieces that we would typically work with students on in our speech language sessions, expanding their vocabulary, working on sentence structure, working on inferencing, using context clues, understanding metaphor and simile, being able to tell a narrative. Early on for little kids, we might be working with them on print concepts like this is where the page numbers are, this is how you turn the page, this is a word, this is a sentence. And then the word recognition pieces that you see on the bottom there are more like the mechanics of reading, being able to sound out words, count the number of syllables in a word, being able to manipulate those sounds. Can you blend sounds together? Can you delete one of the sounds off of a word? Can you spell? And then developing sight words. So at Groves, typically the tutors and the classroom teachers are hitting those bottom pieces really hard in terms of reading, and of course some vocabulary, of course the comprehension piece. But then for students that need extra support, we're really helping bolster that language piece that's connected to the print piece.
And the literacy skills are developing from really early on in childhood. So students' exposure to books, kind of understanding the flow of how you orient a book and flipping the page that they get through those early shared book reading experiences are some of the building blocks that can foster some interest and familiarity with those literacy skills. So this starts really early on, and it continues to be super important as students continue to progress through school. And all of these literacy skills can be kind of supported through listening to books, reading books, audio books, sharing that experience with a peer or a sibling or a parent, anything to kind of support the interest and exposure to literacy is super helpful. Like we've done on some of the previous slides, here is another section of kind of some developmental milestones and references for you guys. So this breaks down literacy development into different age groups of what are some skills that might be acquired at different ages through that early elementary period. And this can also give you a reference point of what might be expected of your student at school in different age levels, or kind of how to compare your student's performance to these developmental milestones.
These are just some pretty simple ideas for how you can promote literacy at home from a really, really young age. A lot of these are pretty self-explanatory, and you're probably already doing with your students or did when they were younger. The reason that we wanted to talk about literacy and learning disorders is because of the really high correlation between spoken language and written language, right? So one of the red flags you're going to want to look for is if your child is having a lot of difficulty with spoken language is a precursor to written language. So we're going to want to assess that early, and then we're also going to continue to monitor and intervene and make sure that their written language is developing the way it should be as well. And then vice versa, if your student is getting to first, second grade and all of a sudden we're noticing all these difficulties with reading and writing, probably not a bad idea to then also look at their spoken language as well, because they're just so highly connected. These two stats show that here. 50 to 70% of elementary students with a reading disorder also have a spoken language disorder. And then 55 to 60% of kids with a spoken language disorder also have a writing disorder. So all these processes in our brain are very highly connected.
All right, we're shifting gears a little bit now. So are there any questions at this point of things we've covered so far?
Nothing right now.
Sounds good. So the next thing we're going to talk about is something called pragmatic language. And pragmatics refers to the social side of language and how we use language in social interactions. So this is something that we're all doing all the time. This includes things like your tone of voice, your ability of turn taking, so letting your other kind of conversation partner to chime in, understanding sarcasm and slang, or making inferences on what somebody's saying. All of these are considered pragmatics or social language. And it also encompasses nonverbal pieces like the eye contact and the personal space bubbles that can impact how somebody feels or is kind of perceiving you in conversation. So this is something that is within the speech language pathologist scope of practice. We can address this in intervention sessions. We here at Grove like to we prioritize or see this as most effective when it's done in social groups. So when a student is working one-on-one with a speech language pathologist, it's a lot harder to replicate these social situations and target these skills and make it generalize effectively. So these are skills that are best addressed when there is a group of peers that can be practicing together, and then it generalizes more fluidly. So social skills groups are highly recommended for addressing pragmatic language deficits. There is a social pragmatic communication disorder diagnosis. And this is for students who have difficulties with using verbal and nonverbal language for social purposes. And this is something that can be a standalone diagnosis. So this is an isolated difficulty for an individual, or it can co-occur with different diagnoses as well. So looking at things like developmental disability, intellectual disability, or different developmental disorders. And when this is happening, we, as in the speech and language therapy, can intervene on both those language pieces of inferencing, picking up on slang and subtle cues, as well as supporting the nonverbal side of communication.
I would just add here that that particular diagnosis of social pragmatic communication disorder is pretty rare, because if you think about a student that has difficulty with language for social purposes, the social realm of language is typically easier to grasp than the more complicated academic type language. So typically this is a diagnosis that we don't see super often because it's social pragmatic difficulty comes along with a lot of some of these other disorders, or is part of a language disorder, reading and writing disorder. So you probably won't see this diagnosis super commonly. It's usually not just its own isolated thing.
All right, so looking at what might be difficult if an individual has social language difficulties, here is not an all-inclusive, but some kind of ideas or things to look out for. This could include staying on topic in conversation, turn taking, organizing their ideas and telling stories. There's kind of a theme here. These are things we've mentioned earlier with attention difficulties and executive functioning. So when we are looking at a student in a speech and language evaluation, we're really piecing out kind of what is causing these difficulties, since it can come from a multitude of factors. So these are just a couple ideas or things to look out for that fall into that pragmatic or social language.
And then sorry, Catherine.
No, you're good.
I put this link on here and I'm going to click on it and hopefully not totally derail everything that we're doing. But when you get the PDF of the presentation, there's going to be links on it. We're going to show you some other slides with links on them too. But this is kind of a cool resource for benchmarks for different ages of where your student should be in theory with their social skills. So if you have concerns about your students' social pragmatic skills, this is a good resource to check out for where they should be at for the different ages. And I have to figure out now. There we go. Cool.
All right, and one last slide or example of pragmatic language is how inferencing is impacted. So part of the pragmatic piece is being able to take somebody else's perspective or understand reading between the lines. So one example is if somebody were to say, remember, it's wet outside, somebody who might have difficulty with interpreting inferences might just think, okay, it's wet. So what? When in reality, the person might be hinting at, are you wearing your rain boots? You have an umbrella. Don't go down the slide or else you're going to get wet. So there's some academic impacts as well to having difficulty with things like inference.
Okay, the next piece we're going to talk about is fluency. This is more commonly referred to as stuttering. The cause of stuttering is not known. There's a lot of theories out there, but we really haven't figured out why people stutter. We do know that there's a little bit of a hereditary component. And we also know that there are types of stutters or disfluencies that are considered typical that anyone will make. Those are things like I just did, saying starting a sentence and then revising it, repeating multiple words, or starting a word and then getting lost and repeating it, not finishing your whole thought. Those are all kind of considered typical. But then there are disfluencies that are not considered typical that we can intervene on. So things like repeating the first sound in a word multiple times, like go. That's probably the most common form of stuttering that people think of. There's also prolongations. So that would sound a little bit like this. Stop. So it takes a second for the rest of that word to come out. And then there might be blocks too, where you're trying to produce a word, and with a block, you might even have facial grimaces or body movements, and you're really trying to get it out. So you might see on someone's face that they're trying to form that word like ball, and then you see it come out. So those are considered more the atypical forms of stuttering that we would want to look out for. Children that start stuttering before the age of 3.5 are pretty likely to outgrow it. Between 75 to 80% of kids who start stuttering will stop within a year or two without any intervention. So there's a lot of kids who stutter developmentally and then grow out of it. Children who stutter usually can overcome it before the age of 7. There can be direct treatment where the speech language pathologist would work with the child, or there can be indirect treatment where the speech language pathologist would work with the parents and work with them on how they can help the child at home. After the age of 7, if a student is still stuttering, it's likely that that's going to be part of their life at varying degrees always. It might only happen in certain scenarios. It might only happen with lack of sleep or with stress. So there, before the age of 7, the treatment is really focused on remediating the stutter. After the age of 7, the treatment really focuses on acceptance of your stutter, learning about it and why it's happening, learning about how you can advocate for yourself, and then using strategies to reduce the severity of your stutter in particular scenarios. But after the age of 7, it's pretty safe to assume that that stutter is not going to totally go away. And here are some, this is just another reference slide for you. Identify the signs. This was a campaign that was done for Better Hearing and Speech Month. So these visuals are really nice. And this is some signs of stuttering and some tips for parents. And if that's a concern, you should reach out to a speech language pathologist. Any questions about that area? All right.
I'll unmute myself. Next, we're going to talk about voice disorders, and voice refers to how we perceive a person's vocal production. So this is when your vocal folds are vibrating to create the voice that we make. And this is happening in your larynx, that's right in your throat. A voice disorder is something that impacts the perception or production of the vocal quality. One really common voice disorder that most people hear about is nodules or polyps, and those are kind of like blisters on your vocal folds. They might occur from excessive yelling or vocal use, or sometimes it happens just in your, from your average daily use. There isn't always a reason. And if you're experiencing a change in your vocal quality, like you're noticing your voice is more hoarse or your student's voice is more hoarse, or they seem to be kind of pushing really hard to get a voice out, that might be cause for pursuing a speech and language meeting to see if there is some structural voice change going on for your student. On the next slide, there's a picture of what vocal folds kind of look like and what a nodule is. There we go. So over on this side, you can see the vocal folds come together really nicely. When they're like that, they vibrate, and that's what creates the sound of our voice. And when there's a nodule on them, or that little blister, it changes the way that they vibrate, and so then the sound that comes out is different. So if you're noticing any changes in that vocal quality, it's worth getting a evaluation to see if there is some structural impact or difference going on.
A good example of this is sometimes we'll have students come in and we always are taking note of if their voice sounds harsh, or if their voice sounds like a whisper, or if it sounds like they have a cold. And we'll usually bring that to the attention of the parent, and sometimes they'll say, oh yeah, he has really bad allergies right now. So then we're not worried about it as much. But sometimes a kid has a hoarse vocal quality all the time, and you don't realize it unless you think about it for a second. And I had a student a few years ago that I evaluated who had that kind of really hoarse voice quality. It always sounded really strained like this. And I brought it up to parents wondering if it was just like he had a cold and lost his voice from coughing a lot or whatever. And they said, no, that's kind of what he always sounds like. We haven't really ever thought about it. And they brought him to an ENT, and he did in fact have nodules. So it's something that happens probably more commonly than you would think. So just something to take note of. My mom actually, fun fact, my mom actually has a vocal polyp that she did voice therapy for and can't get rid of, and now needs surgery for. So it is something that you want to try to catch and intervene on before it gets worse.
So similarly to voice is something called resonance, and that is how air passes through the nasal cavity, and that really impacts the sound of our speech production. So in the English language, air should only be coming through your nasal cavity when you're producing the and ing sounds. Otherwise, your nasal cavity is kind of blocked off. You can see kind of down here in this picture, the back of your palate or the roof of your mouth goes up and blocks your nasal cavity, so no air is going through there. If there is some structural difference that's changing a student's resonance, it might sound like they always have a cold, so they might sound too stuffy, or there might be too much air coming through, so the air is going through their nose when it shouldn't, and that has kind of a different sound to it. I can't make it. I can't control my palate to make that sound. But when you hear it, you can tell it sounds a little bit different. Some reasons or some causes that might impact a student's resonance. One of them is the cleft palate. So if there is an opening or airflow between that oral cavity and the nasal cavity, air will be coming through the nasal passage on all sounds most likely. So that will change the resonance or vocal quality of their sounds. Apraxia is that motor planning difficulty that I mentioned earlier. So that might impact a student's ability to control when that palate is closing and changing and closing off that nasal cavity. Enlarged adenoids, that can also impact resonance. And adenoids sit back right at the back of a kid's throat. They're kind of by your tonsils. And if they are too big, they might always be blocking this passage between the mouth and the nasal cavity in the back. So that is another thing that might cause their resonance to sound different, and they might always sound like they have a cold even if they don't. So adenoids are often connected with, if somebody gets their tonsils out, sometimes they remove their adenoids as well. This can be done sometimes if it's blocking too much of the airway passage that impacts their airflow when they're sleeping. So it can have some serious implications, but it does impact that voice and resonance quality as well.
One of the biggest signs, well, I don't know if it's one of the biggest signs, but one of the signs of this type of difficulty with resonance and the blocking of the airway with those enlarged adenoids is when a student can't chew with their mouth closed because they can't breathe while they are chewing unless their mouth is open, because they're always breathing through their mouth. So that's a sign that there's some kind of blockage happening where they aren't able to take in as much air as they need to through their nose. So they're doing a lot of mouth breathing. They have trouble breathing while they're eating. So that's one of the signs.
All right, I kind of already touched on these. The hypernasality is when there is too much air coming through the nose, nasal passage, and the hyponasality is when there's not enough, maybe that enlarged adenoid that's blocking the air. And this is a good reference, like Janice from Friends. That's what it sounds like, the sound that I can't make. So those are some what it sounds like if there's differences in resonance. And if there are any concerns with either the vocal quality or resonance, again, reaching out to an ENT or a speech pathologist can assess and look at these aspects of speech production as well.
I'm going to move through these next ones pretty quickly, and I might actually skip some of them because most of these, if your student is having difficulty in this area or needs an alternative communication device, it's something that you would already know and probably already have intervened on with a speech language pathologist. But just maybe an interesting fact is that one of the things that we work on is working with people that need other forms of communicating besides using their mouth. So sign language, communication boards, electronic devices that have a voice that come out of them. We are, speech language pathologists are in charge of helping get those devices set up and teach users how to use them, teach parents and teachers how to help students with them. So that's something that a speech language pathologist would do. We also can help with feeding and swallowing. We're usually on a team with a doctor, an occupational therapist, but it is something that sometimes speech language pathologists can help intervene on if students are either really picky eaters or have trouble with the mechanics of eating and swallowing. And there's a reference slide for you there for some of the signs. And then we also can help with hearing. So either students that are relearning to listen and relearning speech after they've maybe lost hearing in one ear, or they've gotten a cochlear implant, so now they have more access to sound, or working with students that are deaf and hard of hearing and figuring out the best way for them to communicate. And some people that are deaf and hard of hearing have the desire to use their voice if they can, so we would help on that team as well. And oftentimes the speech language pathologist in schools is in charge of helping students with hearing difficulties, making sure that their hearing aids have batteries and that their teachers are using amplification devices, things like that. This slide is all links for you guys to be able to use. So when you get the PDF, these are things you'll be able to click on and access. Oops, sorry. So we've got social communication disorders is in there. There's some ideas for building your skills for kids kindergarten to second grade and then 3rd to 5th grade. And then there's some different charts for literacy development and speech language development. So check those out if you are interested. And then I wanted to make sure we got to the intervention options. So there are choices for intervention if you're concerned about your kids' speech language skills. Public schools offer services from birth through 21 years old. They do need to qualify under an IFSP or an IEP, and they do have to fall below a certain threshold on multiple standardized assessments, and the deficits they're having need to be affecting their academics. If all of those qualifications are met, then they receive services for free. And public schools also provide services to students that live in the district but go to private schools. So if your student goes to a private school, but you feel like this might be a difficulty area for them, you could talk to the public schools about getting an evaluation. Depending on the specialists in the building, a speech language pathologist might focus on literacy, but typically in the public schools, they have literacy specialists that do that, or special education teachers. And then speech language pathologists are also sometimes part of the response to intervention team before a student starts individual intervention with special education. This is a helpful flow chart from ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, about kind of the process of what a 504 is, what an IEP is, what to do when you're concerned. So that's a reference for you guys. There's also the option of getting intervention through a medical setting. And this would be like an outpatient clinic, like at Children's Hospital, or there's a lot of different clinics that accept medical insurance that a lot of times it's speech language therapy and occupational therapy and physical therapy all in the same building. It requires a referral from your doctor to do an evaluation. They do services for all ages. Of course, different providers have different specialty areas. And then usually they need to show progress on a yearly evaluation, and they also need to submit 90-day progress reports to continue to be covered by insurance. But that is one of the options as well. And then speech language therapy at Groves, we have an emphasis on oral language, writing, reading comprehension, executive functioning, sometimes social skills, articulation, and fluency. We do not have a heavy focus in our sessions on decoding, reading fluency, or spelling because we have such specialized classroom teachers and tutors that can do that. At Groves, since we are an independent school and we also don't bill insurance, we don't have to have the same thresholds that kids need to fall under in order to quote unquote qualify for services. Students just need to show a need and be interested in an evaluation, and we can do that. And we work with students that go to Groves as part of our school, and then we also work with lots of clients from the community through our Learning Center. And then we've got some fun little case study quiz questions for you, but I want a quick look at the chat. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, there were just a few people that were actually wondering about speaking volume and wondering, is this why my kid screams at me when we were talking about the voice and resonance portion?
I don't know why your child would be screaming at you. It could be a variety of reasons, but yes, if they are having trouble projecting their voice, it could be. But I would imagine that could be a multitude of things. And okay, so these are just some quick, if you want to participate, these are some quick examples. We want to know, would you be concerned about this student's speech language skills? So pop in the chat if you want and vote. So a 4-year-old in preschool who can't say her R correctly, is that somebody that we would want to refer for a speech language evaluation, or is that not so much of a concern for us? Any input there? Courtney's guessing no. Any other brave souls that want to make a guess? Courtney, you are correct. This would be a no. We're not quite worried about R at the age of 4, but it would be something we'd want to watch. And if they get up to like 5 or 6 and still can't say their R sounds, that would be something that we would want to look at. The next one is an 11-year-old middle schooler who produces sound repetitions like sister frequently when they're reading. Is that someone that we would want to refer for a speech language assessment? Yes, yes. You guys are correct. How about a first grade student who has difficulty answering WH questions like who, what, when, where, why? Yes, that is somebody that we would want to look into further. A kindergarten student who has trouble telling a cohesive story. I'm getting a no on that one. This one is, it kind of depends on what kind of story they're trying to tell. If they are having a really hard time even just telling you about their day, we would maybe want to look into that. If they can tell a story that's organized, but it seems kind of short or not a lot of detail, that maybe wouldn't be as much a concern because they're just 5. But it is something we would probably want to monitor. A high school student with average language scores, but difficulty organizing materials, writing an essay, and turning in assignments on time. For sure, yes. We would want to see this student, absolutely, and see if there was anything we could do to help them. And then there might be one more. An elementary-aged child who sounds sick all the time. Yes, that would be another yes. And we at Groves would not see that student for their voice evaluation, but it would be something that if a parent brought it to our attention, we would say, yes, that's something that you'd want to look into, and we would refer them to either their ENT or a speech language pathologist that specializes in voice. And then a 7-year-old who can't say S correctly. Yep, that is another one. By the age of 7, they should have all those sounds developed. So if they are not fully developed, that would be a concern, and we would want to do an evaluation. And the rest is just all the places where we got this information for our presentation. So those are just all of our references. Any other questions that we can answer for you guys before we log off? I see that you tried to get some of your preschool coworkers to watch. Well, good thing we're recording and it will be available for them. So you can let them know and they can tune in. Any other questions before we log off for the evening? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone who tuned in and joined us tonight. We appreciate it and hope it was helpful. Joanna's going to send out the PDF, and our email addresses are on the title slide. So if you think of something later on that you wished you would have asked us, feel free to shoot us an email and we're happy to help.
All right, and I will also be sending out the link to watch the video soon. We'll get that posted on our website, and also let me know if you need CEU credits for attending this workshop. So thanks everybody for attending.
All right, have a great night, everyone.